All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that you could join us for today's MTI Research Snaps webinar, The Effects of Bike Lending on Commuting to Work, the Google case study, which explores several topics that are near and dear to our hearts in the Bay Area: sustainability, technology, and the often too dreaded work commute. My name is Dr. Karen Philbrick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. MTI leads two multi-university competitively selected consortia. The first, funded through the U.S. Department of Transportation, is the Mineta Consortium for Transportation Mobility, and the second, funded through the California Road Repair and Accountability Act, better known as Senate Bill 1, is the California State University Transportation Consortium. All of our work focuses on improving the mobility of people and goods, and we accomplish this through surface transportation research, technology transfer, education, and workforce development. Today's webinar focuses on the effects of e-bike lending programs on commuting behavior, including the recent Google case study. We saw e-bike purchases boom in the early days of the pandemic, excuse me, with sales increasing an average of 150% nationwide from 2019 to 2020. And in some cases, we saw that rate explode to over 300%, for example, in Los Angeles. E-bike awareness and lending programs have spread on college campuses, and now they've recently arrived on big tech campuses as well. Of course, conventional bikes remain popular, and both are sustainable options that improve commuting conditions. Now, conventional bikes also come with a variety of health benefits, of course, but both really directly impact our commuting experience. The role of e-bike and bike lending as a transportation demand management program is largely untested in the United States. We need to know how effective these e-bike lending programs are at increasing work commuting, and what are the factors that influence success. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. We have Dylan Fitch, who's research faculty and co-director of the Bicycling Plus Research Collaborative at the Institute for Transportation Studies at UC Davis, where he studies travel behavior and transportation planning. He also occasionally teaches in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. Through field experiences, travel surveys, crowdsourced data, Dylan's recent research has focused on how road environments influence people's bicycling attitudes and their behavior. His current work explores the role of bike sharing and other micromobility services on changing travel behavior. Can't wait to hear what you have to say, Dylan. Joining Dylan is Lucy Noble, Google's Transportation Demand Management Program Manager. She's been in the transportation industry for 10 years, and we can't wait to hear what she has to say. We round out our team of presenters with Terry Mack, who's the Senior of Operations for Halcon, managing Google's bike program. During the webinar, if you have any questions for our presenters, we invite you to drop those into the Q&A feature or into the chat. We are recording this webinar, and a link will be distributed shortly after we conclude today's event. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Lucy, please take the floor.
Great, thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion about bikes today. So I'll just introduce Google a little bit. Dylan, if you can go to the next slide, please. So for those that know Google, we are in the Bay Area. Our main campus is in Mountain View and Sunnyvale, which is the lower two red dots. And as you can see, the green dots is where all of our employees are roughly. So we have employees from as far as Sacramento to as south as Santa Cruz. And one of our main goals is to help employees get to work in an easy, convenient way without creating a lot of traffic. So we're trying to reduce traffic and parking demand. And as you can see, we have the interesting geography of the Bay. And so getting into the campus, there's only quite just two routes that we can get into both either the Mountain View and the Sunnyvale campus. So that makes traffic management a little bit tricky. So I wanted to introduce some of the challenges that we have at both our headquarters here in Mountain View and Sunnyvale, is that we have free parking, which, as many of you might know, does incentivize driving. So we do try to influence our employees' behavior by offering them a variety of options. One of our flagship program is our commuter shuttle, which about 33% of our employees already take the shuttle. And of course, all of this is pre-pandemic numbers. We have yet to return to our office in full force. That will happen later this month. So other challenges that we have, of course, is the heavy traffic. We have trip cap restrictions from the city. We have parking, but it's not always adjacent and close to where people want to park. So in some areas, we have huge parking demand. In other areas, there's plenty of parking. So it's hard to even that out just because where our office buildings are and so forth. And in those areas where we do have high parking demand, we do have valet service. We have free EV charging. We have one of the biggest corporate charging infrastructures in the US, but that also incentivizes solo driving. And so we're thinking of many different ways to encourage our employees to avoid driving solo. And we haven't crossed the paying for parking hurdle yet, but we know that that's very effective. Dylan can go to the next slide. So what we also learned is that a lot of our employees who live nearby within the 10-mile range are driving solo. They're not using any of our alternatives because driving is very convenient for them. And so that's why we've decided to focus on bicycling for that community, for that group. And we know that there's a group of people in the population who are no way, no how interested in biking. They're either not skilled at it, not interested, or they just live too far away for bike to be an option for them. But a huge percentage, the 60%, is interested but concerned. And so we've been mainly focused on targeting that 60% of people who are interested but concerned and are willing to try something new. And that interested but concerned, we did another survey to figure out why they haven't started biking yet. And so you can see here, some of them lack the skills, some of them don't have access to a bike, and a larger percentage of them perceive that there's difficulty or there's some perceived effort of difficulty. And so we decided to create a program that solves all of these three main problems. And that's where our commuter bike on-ramp program was created about 6 years ago. Dylan, thank you. So with creating that program, we wanted to have these three principles in mind. So we're trying to help people build a biking habit. We try to make it easy for them, and of course, make it fun and attractive and social. So building the habits part, our commuter bike on-ramp program, we offered employees a free bike to use. So we actually started with e-bikes for those who perceived that it was difficult or they live too far away, or they just haven't gone on a bike in a long time and the sweat factor was an issue or whatever it is, the e-bike was very attractive. So we actually started with e-bikes. And Dylan will go through some of the timeline and when we introduced a variety of bikes that included just regular commuter bikes. We thought a habit would be built by 3 to 6 months. So we offered people to use the bike for up to 6 months. And they had to, of course, log their trips so that we know that they're continuing to use it. They were required to bike 60% of the time. So at that time, we were commuting to the office 5 days a week. And so 60% of the time was we hope that they can commit to biking to work 3 days a week at least. We're making it easy for them, which means we have ample parking. We have showers in the office. We have lockers where they can store their personal items. And we even have washing machines for anybody that might need to wash their clothes in between their rides. And lastly, making it attractive and fun and social. So we did a lot of fun events, social events. We have tons of incentives, but mainly the program is about offering them a free bike to use with all the things included, including helmets, locks, lights, and everything that they may need to get their bike commute together. And so I'll pass it over to Dylan, who has worked with us for over a year on looking at all the data that we've collected in the last 6 years to show you how what part of the program was successful and what part we could adjust. Dylan, to you.
Great, thanks, Lucy. So the barriers that Lucy talked about are not unique to Google. They kind of mirror the barriers that are presented in the bike literature. So one thing we don't necessarily touch on is traffic safety. That's a big barrier, but distance for sure in this project with e-bikes, being able to kind of shorten the distance because people can use the e-bikes to get to work a little quicker. Some of the barriers of ownership costs and time that are in the literature, this program heavily focuses on that. So it's not just applicable to Google. We think this evaluation is applicable to a lot of large employers or around the country. And then also knowledge. Lucy didn't mention, but I think a lot of the barriers for the employees was just they didn't know what kind of bike to pick. And they didn't have the time to go find the bike and maintain the bike. So these barriers are being reduced in this program, and sometimes in the bike literature, these are less discussed, but maybe really important. So quick touch on the importance of e-bikes because a lot of the bike fleet are e-bikes from Europe. Mostly, we know that. When e-bike interventions result in greater biking rates compared to conventional bikes, greater car substitution, and particularly greater change in behavior for commuting. So it's natural that e-bikes were a starting point for Google's program. We also know awareness is growing, especially with the pandemic. And then Karen also mentioned that there are still health benefits for e-bicycling. So we're beyond the e-bikes are cheating phase. They are not. The potential for bike lending, as Karen mentioned, it's a little unclear in the US because there haven't been good evaluations. So we think it's going to be a big increase in awareness and consideration for bike commuting. The distance barrier, especially with e-bikes, should come down. And then this big question mark of how important is the barrier of ownership in terms of costs and time. It's not just the cost of the bike and the maintenance, but the time it takes to go get the bike, to maintain the bike. These could be substantial. All right, so the program timeline, as Lucy mentioned, this has been going on for a long time. So if you think about e-bikes in 2015, that's before e-bikes were a thing in the US. So these were top of the line e-bikes back then, and I think the battery range is somewhere between 30 and 60 miles. And but the program started as a pilot and then made it permanent and added conventional bikes in 2016. Conventional bikes became a permanent part of the program by 2017, and then by 2018, events were hosted during the ramp-off period. So it's a 6-month lending period and then an incentive to buy a bike. And what Google noticed is that a lot of people were leaving that incentive on the table and not taking advantage. That was $300. So once they started hosting events on campus, but local bike shops coming to campus to buy the bikes, it was as easy as you can imagine. An employee comes and looks at a bike, they decide, yeah, they want that bike, and they just reserve it, and then the bike ends up at their door. They don't have to go to the bike shop. They don't have, the barrier is very, very minimal. So those events started occurring at greater frequency by 2019, and the incentive amount increased to $500. So our study stops right at the end of 2019, so pre-COVID. The program was kind of changed for home use during the pandemic. So the most important part of all the analysis that I'll show is that we broke the trip reporting and the travel behavior into 3 phases: a before period, a during, and an after. And this is person specific because, of course, everyone enters the program at a different time. So it's not like 2016 was before, 2017 was after. It's depending on where the person was in the program. We included data up to 1 year prior to the program in the trips. So some people are reporting trip data for other purposes like commuter rewards. Lucy can talk more about these in Q&A, but it's, it's essentially a point accruing to get, swag and stuff like that. The during period is that 6-month lease plus or minus a few weeks, depending on circumstance with the person. And then the after period is any amount of time, any amount of trips being reported by the participant after they've graduated from the program. And again, the motivations are a little unclear, but probably mostly to get other commuter benefits. The main two, we looked at really 2 outcome variables. The first is bicycling to work. That's the kind of primary goal of the program. So we wanted to look at what happened with bicycling to work. But of course, the secondary goal is why we want bicycling to work to increase is to reduce, and Google focuses on this a lot, is to reduce single occupancy vehicle driving to work. So I'm gonna look at that at the end of the talk. And basically, we want them to mirror each other and not to ruin the surprise, which maybe will keep you tuned in. They do mirror each other quite well in this program. So we have a lot of data, more data than we knew what to do with. So if you look across the before, during, and after phases in the rows, and you look to the far right, those are the records that we used in our models. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of trips, or hundreds of thousands of commutes, actually, because we simplified the data to commutes. Many unique months and many unique persons, but the during period has the most data, and that's because that's the only period that was required. Trip reporting was required by participants. In the before and after, it wasn't required, and so there's less data. And there's potential bias differences for the reason why people are reporting trips in those periods as well. We looked at 3 kind of sources of data. First was the survey data. So when participants or potential participants applied, they gave some information about themselves. Of course, Google doesn't collect a lot of data that we would normally like to collect for travel behavior. Nothing about household characteristics, income. So it's pretty light on person level variables. But we also have some exit survey data from a subsample of participants that we used for validation a little bit. The primary data we use is this trip reporting, and that comes in 2 forms. A self-reported web form that's filled out monthly. Early on in the program, it was less than monthly, but it quickly got to monthly. And then also people were able to connect their Strava account and automatically have the reporting done when they biked with Strava turned on. We'll look at the differences between the two, which are one of the most interesting findings. We also use some operations tracking data, bike issuing, graduation. This just helped figure out each participant's before, during, and after periods. But it took some time to triangulate that. So we synthesized all this data, and we realized we had too much data to estimate the models that we wanted to estimate, which were these complex multi-level models. And because the data is done in trips, it's pretty messy. And so what we did was we looked at morning commutes and afternoon commutes, which is in the 5-day work week, because that, again, is the program focus. And we realized that the morning and afternoon mirrored each other so well that we just focused on one, which is morning commutes. And then we took those morning commutes and aggregated them to month. We considered weekly aggregations. We couldn't get models to converge for weekly, to estimate week level effects. And we didn't have any week level variables. We could have gone out and got weather data, but we made the assumption that aggregating to the month and considering the unique month was going to help us account for the variation in weather. And everybody who's participating in a given month is experiencing the same weather because we're all commuting to the same location. So we analyzed the data, as I was saying, through multi-level models. the two key pieces of variation that we're looking at are the person level and the monthly level variation. I'll show that soon. And then the model type was a zero inflated aggregated binomial regression. I won't get into the details, but conceptually, what we're trying to do is estimate the likelihood that each participant bikes on a commute day, or SOV commutes when we're modeling SOV commute behavior. And we ignore holidays or work from home and PTO. So those days are non-commute days for each, and they vary by person. Okay, so before we get into the model predictions, we'll look first just at the raw trip reporting data. And so on the x-axis are the number of bike trips per week, and on the y, the number of participants. These are averages. And then we have them tiled by before, during, and after. And so what we can see is the before period, we have this kind of big bar and zero, right? Not a lot of biking. But there was a lot of biking in the population, at least a lot of bike trips recorded in the population. So that wasn't the aim of the program. The program aimed to get all these zeros turned into biking. And it's not clear whether the reason why there's all this biking in the before period is because people were biking within a year, but maybe right up to the program start, they weren't, right? They could have had a biking behavior, but then it disappeared and they were trying to re-engage biking as a commute mode. Or it could be that, you know, participants were self-reporting not to have biked to get the bike to be a part of the program, when in actuality they were biking some and they were getting commuter rewards from it. So we don't really know. But so even if there was this much biking going on in the before period, what we see is in the raw data, this big shift in the histogram during and after. Basically removing all those zeros and pushing them up, you know, into the middle part of the histogram, you know, 3 times a week, kind of behavior. So this was a good start to give us an idea of the effectiveness of the program. But it doesn't adjust for all the other variables that we think matter. And so from here on out, I'm just going to report model predictions of different variable effects. So the first one is looking at variation by person and by month. So this is a little busy of a plot, but I find it fascinating. And what we're looking at is every participant in the program from the start of the earliest possible before period in 2014 through the end of 2019. And it's the predicted bike to work rate for a given month for every person. So it's sparse on the left-hand side because there weren't very many participants in the pilot, and then it gets denser and denser. We see this massive spread between person variation. You know, some people are biking 85% of the time, predicted to bike 85% of the time. Others are down in the 25% of the time. But, you know, very few people are lower than that. So when they're in the program, they're biking some. And that person level variation is much larger than, say, the month level variation. So if you look at the change in each individual line, you can see some obvious dips. Those are winter periods, most of them, which makes sense. It's the rainy, wet season, biking declines. And then they ramp back up in the spring. There are some strangeness here that we observe, like the summer in 2018, there's a 2-month period with that really strong decline, which we suspected was due to smoke from wildfires, but we couldn't find any evidence of smoke during that period. So it's a big question mark of what happened 2018 that we haven't been able to figure out. But for the most part, this variation seems to make a lot of sense. And it shows us that there's a big range in biking to work within the population. The first variable I'll talk about, which is a big one in the bike literature and one of interest, is commute distance. And what we see is that commute distance matters a lot, not surprising. And it's non-linear. When people are living closer to work, their bike to work rate is expected to be much higher. But I think more striking is the fact that what we're seeing with these participants is, say, look at commute distance around 15 miles on the x-axis, and you see they're still predicted to bike half the time. That's amazing. Like in the general population, if you live 15 miles from work, your probability of biking is probably next to nothing. So it's showing that distance is less of a barrier for these participants, and potentially bike lending could work for longer distance commutes, especially e-bike lending. And the benefits could be greater, right? A 15-mile commuter who does it twice a week, maybe those vehicle mile reduction is greater than the person living 2 miles from work who bikes every day. So it's a really good sign that lending could be more than just a couple mile commuters. Probably one of the most surprising findings is this one, that the e-bike users biked less. Now, this is not just an effect of bike type. It's also a huge self-selection effect, because program participants were asking for an e-bike or asking for a commuter or conventional bike. So it could be that the conventional people that chose the conventional bike were looking to make their commute part of their kind of fitness goals, and they were more motivated to do it more often, which is why they're biking more. But it could be that the e-bike people like never would have participated if it wasn't for the e-bike, and that's really important. So the takeaway shouldn't be that, oh, conventional bike lending is better. They bike more frequently, health benefits are better, and they're a lot cheaper. Yay, let's just do conventional bike lending. The counterfactual doesn't make sense, because all those people that chose the e-bikes, they may never have participated. So, and these rates aren't that different. We're talking about 63, percent to 59%. They're pretty comparable. We did do some modeling of whether the e-bikes moderated the effect of distance, and to some degree, yes, but they came out about equal. So the e-bike people do have a little bit further distances on average, but essentially it's a wash between bike type in our data. The other interesting finding we found was multimodal commuting. So when I say multimodal, I mean using your bike to connect to transit, or using your bike to connect to the G-Bus shuttle. So Google offers these shuttle services that are very popular. And this only pertains to the commuter bikes, the conventional bikes, not the e-bikes, because the e-bikes weren't allowed on the G-Bus or on transit. And what we found was that although there's only a small sample of the participants that were doing multimodal commutes, those that were commuting by bike and train or G-Bus much more consistently than those that were just bike commuting. And that's the steep rise. The steep rise is just ever using transit on the left-hand side of the plot, and then this gentle rise is how frequently people were using or multimodal commuting. So we'll get into some policy recommendations about this, but I think it's an interesting potential new target, these kind of potential bike transit users that are SOV commuters. The strongest effect and most interesting methodologically is this comparison of Strava reports versus self-reports. And here we see that people that sometimes use Strava, that's this, close to the 0% on the x-axis, they are predicted to bike at similar rates as the self-reported. The zeros are the self-reported 100% of the time. They actually are predicted to bike a little bit more. But as you get to the 100% recorded commuters for Strava, these are people who only ever reported their commutes by Strava, that rate plummets to around 40%. So we don't know what's causing this. There are a lot of explanations, but probably the most plausible is that self-reports are overly biased. And this could be across the board. People are reporting more bicycling than they're doing, and it could be as much as, say, 20%. There are some other alternative explanations, like the Strava connection is supposed to kind of streamline the reporting, but maybe it's an added hurdle for people that are really competitive with Strava and they're not feeling like making a hard bike ride and it's going to hurt their time or something like that. And maybe it's a pressure thing and it's reducing their bike commuting. There's so many other things. We probably need interviews. What we really need is a random controlled trial to say, use Strava now, self-report now, and we're not going to get that. But it's interesting to consider in terms of the bias of our self-reported data. Okay, the big picture. So what did we learn? What we learned is that the program had a big increase in bike commuting, not surprising. This just looking at the predictions from trip data, the before period is predicted to be less than a quarter of the time bike commuting, and that rises to about 60%. So these are big rises in bike commuting. In the after period, it drops off a little bit. We know that's due to some people not purchasing a bike, so probably not continuing their biking. But it's clear that even with that drop in the after period, that the program has instilled some lasting behavior change. Instead of looking at trip data in the before period, we also could look at the application survey of what people self-reported. And in that case, the program benefits look even larger. So on the before period now, we're looking at just this one survey question: how frequently do you ride a bike on your commute? And we see that that change goes from something like 12% to 60%. So probably the answer is it's somewhere in between these. The survey before data is more close to a real before measurement, while the trip data includes a full year of travel before, so it could have been capturing some biking that was done, a prior commute behavior, you could say. But it's always hard to know which is more accurate. And then, of course, this is all in the context of this potential bias that Strava shows us, which is this all could be down, this all could be over-reported. But it's unlikely that the Strava bias or the self-reporting bias is over, in one of these periods. So the change is still substantial, even if the actual rates are lower than we're modeling. So what does this look like for miles? Well, for bike commute miles, it means most people are increasing their bicycling, and most people are somewhere in the range of 5 to 25 miles per week per person. That's a lot. Doesn't seem like a lot, but when you add it up, that's a lot of bike miles. And then when we start, so the benefit calculations could be great. We haven't done any of that, but if we look at health benefits, probably bike miles is the way to start. So we also looked at SOV commuting. We modeled that separately. We didn't have near as robust data. We only had about 33 participants reporting that, and only in the during period, because it wasn't required. We suspect that people were reporting that because they saw a form that had a bunch of modes, and maybe they misunderstood that they had to fill it all out. But we don't really know why 33% of people were reporting all their commute modes during the program, but it was really nice that they did, so we could look at it. We did have a survey measure of the before SOV commuting. The whole program was targeting SOV commuters, so it's not surprising that the most common report was 100% of the time, which is this big dark line, and it drops to 0. So on average, the drop isn't quite as severe, but the most common drop is from 100% SOV commute to never SOV commuting during the program. And this just shows that most of the bike behavior that's occurring, the increase in bicycling is substituting for SOV commuting. When we look at SOV commute miles, they kind of mirror the bike commute miles, right? They're all in the negative mostly. There's this big stack at 0, so these are probably people substituting transit or carpooling, which we didn't. So there could still be car miles, but we were focused really on these SOV miles for evaluation. And then we did a fun simulation. So this is a little uncertain, but we took the model of those 33% and we predicted the entire program population SOV mile commute reduction, and then we summed it all up throughout the program. And what we found is that for the 4 years from about 2016 to the end of 2019, we expect it reduced about 400,000 SOV commute miles. And of course, the errors are really large. So it's really between 100 and 800,000. And the errors are large because we're predicting outside of our sample by 67%, right? So we don't have data on everyone in the program for SOV commuting. All right, so if we had to boil it down to kind of what did we find, here's kind of the quick and dirty summary. We had increases about 1.7 to 2.3 days. These are commute days per week. So these are pretty substantial. And we think that equated to about 8.5 to 10.5 miles of biking. And we think that pretty much all of this increase in bicycling was associated with SOV commute decreasing. So that's, substantial for sustainability benefits. And that's mostly because the program targeted SOV commuters. So, as the program expands and it relaxes some of that targeted recruitment, those benefits might not be as strong. But for these 4 years, it seems pretty apparent that the bike miles were substituting for car miles. So in terms of policy recommendations and changes, so Google has already implemented many of these changes along the way as we were studying this data. We suggested that Google consider a permanent lending with no graduation because of that drop off in the after period. And so now Google offers 2 options: this graduate after 6 months with a subsidy to buy, or continue with the free bike. And so, maybe even with the subsidy, the barriers are too large, and the free service is needed to maintain the behavior. We suggested considering alternative vehicle form factors. Some of that was based on comments in the exit survey about needing to drop kids off or do grocery shopping. So maybe a cargo bike is going to be needed in the future to start getting more people on board. But also targeting multimodals. So right now, only the commuter bike could be used to connect to transit and G-Bus, but maybe other vehicle form factors like e-scooters or folding bikes are going to be important. And I'll talk a little bit about in the next slide what Google's doing there. And then consider all distance commuters. So that there was some selection criteria early on about trying to get these close commuters that were bikeable, which I think was a good idea. But now we see that even long distance commuters in the sample, they're biking at substantial rates, and the benefits may be really great, especially with e-bikes. And now Google has started doing that, allowing any distance commuter to join the program. As always, the program should continue to try to target non-bike commuters. The benefits are going to be better for people who are not already biking. But that's also maybe just an early program goal, and now that doesn't have to be such a focus. I also mentioned that the subsidy increased from $300 to $500. I think that's going to be important for people that still choose the option to graduate. E-bike prices are going up, purchasing power is going down, at least now. So, the barrier of owning, especially some of these once you get used to riding a nice e-bike, it's hard to go down to a cheap e-bike. So these e-bikes are at multiple thousands of dollars. So the last thing I'll mention is just this launch of a parallel program that Google is doing. It's a micro vehicle subscription program, and it works where an employee subscribes to an external service provider, and they pay basically a monthly lease for either an e-scooter, a sit-down e-scooter, or an e-bike. And then Google pays the employee $2.50 per one-way commute to use that vehicle. So they still have to report their trips. But the idea is if they're using that vehicle regularly, Google is covering the cost of their subscription, or at least getting close to it. You know, some of the subscriptions on the e-bikes may be still, you'll never recoup all your costs because the lease is too expensive, but you'll get close. And then maybe with the e-scooter, because those leases tend to be cheaper, maybe if you commuted every day, you could cover your full lease. And this really just allows Google to scale faster with demand and fewer staff going forward. You're going to have to add staff as more people start to bike commute and use these services. But if they can build the excitement of a subscription service, then they get more people to change behavior now and not have to wait for staff ramp up. And with that, I think we will stop and welcome questions.
Well, perfect, because we have a lot of them. In fact, we have 15 questions in Q&A and about 15 in the chat. So let's get started here. The first one, do you offer a loan to purchase option where an employee can buy the loaner after the loan period is finished?
Go ahead, Terry.
So we don't currently, but that was one of the probably major feedbacks from a lot of our users. They always, I guess they fell in love with the bike, and their concern was, well, I don't want to give up this bike. You know, I have ridden this for 6 months and I'm attached to it now. So while we don't have this yet, we are working towards a program and changing our program to do this.
Okay, thank you for that. And for those who have joined us today, a link to the final report and research brief has just been dropped into the chat for ease of access. Let's get to the next one here. Has the e-bike loaner program had any notable impact on the ridership of the commuter shuttles, obviously pre-pandemic? Does it seem reasonable that the program could reduce the operational expense of such a costly program to operate in a meaningful manner? Perhaps you want to just take that. Is this a notable impact on ridership?
So there has not been a notable impact on ridership just because our population has been growing in the last few years. So because of the growing population, there's always been an increase in ridership in both the e-bike program and in the commuter shuttle program. So that the answer is no impact on, but we have a lot of participants.
Okay, gotcha. Now this one is slightly different here. How do you deal with rainy days when people are less likely to bike?
That's a good question. We always get that from our users as well. And a lot of them kind of do the work ahead of time. They know that, okay, if I apply for the program and it's going to be in October, and they ask us, okay, well, I'm approved for the program, but can I wait till spring? So a lot of them kind of do the work ahead of time, say optimal time to join the program is spring, so I don't have to worry about these rainy seasons. In the past, we've made some exceptions. We had some of those fires, of course, in the summer, where we would give them a free pass on those the month when we're doing the auditing, so that we'd say, okay, there's no compliance for this month. This will resume when the weather gets better. But we haven't really addressed the weather problem and the rain problem. We just say, sorry, this is the program. You know, the auditing on this aspect is going to be too difficult for us to keep track of everybody. So we just tell them they have to tough it out.
Very good.
And that's partially because we offer it, the compliance is 60% of the time versus 100% of the time, because we know that at some point people are not going to be able to bike every single day. And we've also put together a winter bike safety sales event, where we invite local bike shops to our campus with discounts and subsidies from Google to help employees prepare for the darker, colder, wetter months. So we usually do that around daylight savings in the fall.
Very good, thank you. Now this question I feel is important because it relates to the final report and some of the visuals that you used. Are the figures for the 4 cyclist types that you presented based on Google employees, or are these generic figures from the literature, for example, from the general US population?
So those numbers are from general literature. I believe there's one from Portland that has those specific numbers. There's another one that was done recently, I forgot from which report, But we've also done our internal survey, and it was very, very close. It was about 59 to 60% for that interested but concerned. So those numbers are pretty standard throughout.
Okay, thank you. Dylan, would one way to get better data is to have GPS devices on the bike for future studies? Is that a viable option?
Well, yeah, better data, yes, not a viable option. Mostly because Google would not allow it.
Okay.
Privacy concerns.
Got it. I think that very clearly and very efficiently answered that participant question. So thank you. Do you think that increasing gas prices has had any effect on your data, including employees' decision to both join the program and bike as a form of commuting?
You know, we didn't track gas prices in the study. Terry, do you have any insight on that?
I would say very little, but again, like you said, we didn't really track it, and I haven't heard chatter from our employees about, due to gas prices, I want to join this program. Usually it's about them moving here, they don't have a vehicle and they want to explore biking or some other reason.
Thank you. Did the increased subsidy make a significant difference in the % of users buying bikes after the program?
After the pandemic, and we're going to announce this to our users here pretty soon.
Thank you very much. Is Google considering pricing parking to disincentivize driving? That's part one. Part two is, how do you think the results from this program would change if Google coupled it with parking pricing? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so I mentioned parking pricing early on this presentation because we have not considered it as a solution for the Bay Area. In other locations and other Google offices, there is charging for parking as a strategy to reduce parking demand. But that we're looking into how all that would play into each other. So for now, Bay Area, we're not interested in charging for parking at this time. Part of it is because we live in a suburban office park. It's just not convenient for people to have, there's just not that many options. Public transit options are not great as well. It's still pretty hard to get to our campus by bike. And so we're not considering charging for parking at this time.
Lucy, correct me if I'm wrong. The new subscription services are for any office commuter, is that right? So we may have in the coming years now data where you've got a combined bike or micro vehicle subscription service with parking pricing at those other offices. So maybe we'll learn a little bit about the combined effects.
We will need a repeat webinar if that data does come out, because I think that's going to be super interesting and insightful. Follow-up question on the GPS comment, Dylan. In terms of privacy concerns for GPS devices, can you explain why it is different than a LoJack or other GPS device placed in company cars? If the vehicle is company property and the user agrees to share the data, what legal constraints still exist?
Well, I will let Lucy answer this because I think that, Google won't even collect how many household members are live in your house. They're very, very, it's funny to think of a company that has so much information about so many people around the world, but they have really strong policies on that. So Lucy, go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. We do have really strong policies about privacy and our employees' privacy. So for company cars, usually those are for business use. So tracking for business use is usually okay. But we still have pretty strong policies around that. But because these vehicles are used for commuting, so they're for personal trips, going to their home, to office, or errands and things like that, tracking for that is much more strict, and we decided not to cross that hurdle when we were designing this program, and we thought self-reporting, which was reliable enough for what we needed to do.
Understood. Thank you for that question. I just want to draw people's attention to a resource that was dropped into chat by one of our guests, Tom Lint, for information on e-bike incentive programs, research, and fleet case studies. Also, let's see here. There's another good question right here. Is there any data yet on the e-scooter subsidy program?
Nothing right now that we can share, nothing definitive.
Okay. So I understand that as I'm reading these questions in real time, you may have touched on them earlier in your presentation. So I apologize for the repeat, but I just want to make sure that each person feels they've been addressed and accurately answered. So next question. How can there be an assumption of single occupancy vehicles commuting decrease if there was already a strong conventional cycling cohort before the program?
Yeah, really good question.
Yeah.
You know, we're not sure that when we model SOV commuting, the average is actually greater, the miles reduced or the rate reduced is greater than the bike increase by 2.4 to the best average we got was 2.3 days of increased bicycling, but the SOV drop was 2.4 days of decrease. So it's unsure. Could it be that people are self-reporting, more SOV or less SOV driving? Yes, maybe. Could it be that by putting a bike into the mix, they're actually they're commuting in other ways besides SOV commuting, like they're biking some days and then they're carpooling, or something like that? Maybe. We don't really know, but it's a really good point and a really good limitation in that they mirror each other so well, and yet the trip data suggests that a lot of these people were, at least in the prior year, biking. If you look at the survey data, no, the vast majority of them were not biking right before they started participating. So in that case, the mirroring of SOV decline and biking increase makes more sense.
Thank you. Are there convenient shuttles available to drivers in the cycling range? Lucy, I believe that might be best for you.
Yes, we have shuttles all throughout the Bay Area, and in the cycling range, which we were targeting employees who are in the near distance, definitely we still have shuttles in that area as well.
Great, thank you. And can one of you, I'm not sure who's best suited to answer this, discuss how the new fast track tolls on 101 will be factored into single occupancy vehicle counting? This is a little off topic here. Does anybody have a response to that?
I don't think we know yet. We haven't gone back to the office. We do know that they've been installed, and we don't know how that's going to affect our population yet. We'll see.
I agree. And Lucy, I know this is not particularly related to the topic of today's webinar, but there is a follow-on question related to Google bringing employees back to the central office. Somebody has said that remote work seems to have been effective and easier to sell to employees than pedaling to work. How many employees took advantage of the remote work option to move out of the region?
There is a percentage of people who have moved out and relocated to other offices. There is a percentage that have applied for remote work. And so they don't have an office, they're out somewhere. But we are, as a company, committed to in-person interactions, in-person meetings, discussions. And so we're very excited and happy to bring our employees back. And we do have a number of employees who are interested in coming back to the office.
As an extreme extrovert, I completely understand the desire and the motivation to return to an in-person engagement. So yes. All right, our next guest. I am wondering what might be the driving force of shift of biking behavior? Is it monetary incentives, subsidies, or safe infrastructure like bike lanes? What's going to be that driving force that really gets people to change their behavior?
Dylan, you want to go first?
Well, I think that what's so interesting about this study is that the environment, well, Lucy can say a little bit more about what environmental changes occurred. During those 4 years, bike infrastructure certainly changed. But within the before, during, and after at the person level, probably not a lot of change. So you could think of the environmental stuff as kind of being controlled. So that means that the behavior change that we're seeing is really about the bike the bike lending. And so the bike lending is all about reducing these other, what have been in the bike literature, kind of lower level barriers, time, ownership, time and cost. I mean, in much of the bike literature, ownership is just assumed to be jointly, that the choice to buy a bike is assumed to be jointly made by the choice to commute, right? If you feel like you want to commute, you just go buy a bike. It's pretty low cost. It's not as much of a barrier. And especially you would say that, at least I would have said that for this study, for middle to upper income households. But we see in this study that that's just not the case. And I think it's probably less about the money and more about the time. But Lucy probably has some more insights there.
Yeah, so a lot of our employees choose to commute the way that they commute based on time factor and convenience. And so with biking, time, it may take them a little bit more time, but it might be more convenient for them, or they choose to use biking as a time that they for exercising or coming down from a stressful day or whatever it is. So we're actually doing additional studies on behavior change and why employees choose to bike, what motivates them to bike, what keeps them on the bike. So we've done some studies this past year in 2021, and we're continuing to do those behavioral science research in 2022 to understand what percentage of our employees are driven by these variety of factors.
That's going to be important.
So when those studies are complete, we hope that we can share it as well.
We will look forward to that very much so, Lucy. We have time here for another question, maybe one or two. Do you have the possibility and plans to stratify effects between participants who may have, quote unquote, more favorable cycling infrastructure routes available versus those who commute from less favorable areas or routes?
Yeah, really good question.
Good question.
We intended to do that. We didn't get to it in this project. There's a couple key reasons why. The first is that we have a much smaller sample when we consider who told us where they live. And actually, we don't even know where they live. We know that maybe cross streets or city. So it's pretty vague. We don't have household information. But we were going to attempt, I think, just from city of origin to look at like plausible routes to these campuses. And we started to do a little bit of that work, and then we realized we weren't going to be able to accomplish it within the scope. But I do think it would be fascinating to basically pull out those variables. What kind of bike infrastructure are on plausible paths. This is something that I've done in other research, particularly for high school travel to 3 high schools in the Bay Area. And it does have strong effects for biking to high school. So it probably has strong effects for biking to these campuses as well. And then, interacting those effects with the program lending, I think would be fascinating. I think we also then need to go get a sample of people who are not in the program, right? And see, so that'll tell us whether this interaction is really strong or not.
Well, thank you for that response. Clearly, we need more time together today and a lot more research. We're looking forward to hosting you once again when future data is available. I'd like to thank our speakers, Dylan Fitch, Lucy Noble, and Terry Mack for joining us today. The final report, as I've mentioned previously, is available online, and there is a link in chat if you'd like to take a closer look. Today's slides, a video recording, will also be posted and sent to you individually later this afternoon. Now, before we conclude, I want to take the chance to tell you about 2 more exciting Mineta Transportation Institute events that are upcoming. Please join us on March 17th at noon Pacific for an information session to learn more about San Jose State University's graduate programs in transportation management that are supported by MTI. This program, designed for transportation professionals, offers live online classes and affordable tuition. In fact, you can get this master's degree for as little as $13,000. So when you're ready to take that next step in your career, please join us to learn more. A link to this information session and to our programs is being placed into chat at this very moment. Finally, we hope you will join us for our next webinar on March 24th, also at noon. It's the second part in our How to Be Your Own Boss Without Growing Broke or Crazy series. Learn about the contracting paperwork needed to start your own successful business. Again, thank you for joining us today. We wish you all a safe and productive afternoon. Be well.